Afternoon, everyone. Yeah, at least Laura's the same sex, so. I just want to extend apologies on behalf of Laura Jordan, who is the Wattled Crane Release Project Manager with the KZN Crane Foundation, who should be presenting here today. Unfortunately, she's had a crisis at the Wattled Crane rearing nursery that has 3 chicks at the moment. So she asked me to present today. She asked me yesterday to present today. I'm going to just expand a little bit. The program does focus on the program as a whole, but a lot of my aspects of work is outside of the Wattled Crane Recovery Program, so I will include it. But I've decided to look at the conservation efforts for wattled cranes as a whole, and not just one aspect of the conservation efforts. So firstly, why all the effort to conserve cranes, and in particular wattled cranes? Well, basically, we believe that cranes are the symbols of the natural habitats and ecosystems that supply us with essential life services. We believe that if we have a future where cranes are no longer gracing our skies, then we have a problem much bigger than we may be able to do anything about. They are great species for wetland conservation, excellent flagship species, and I'll show you guys that we've been pretty damn successful in conserving cranes, particularly wattled cranes. So as an introduction, obviously wattled cranes are found through Africa, with the stronghold located in Botswana and Zambia, so sort of southern central Africa. But the South African population is currently listed as critically endangered, with less than 260 adult individuals in the country. They are highly dependent on permanent wetlands for both breeding and foraging. They are long-lived species. They live anything up to 40 years in the wild, and in captivity much, much longer than that. And they only ever attempt to raise 1 chick, even though some pairs, about 20 to 30% of the pairs, will lay 2 eggs. But they'll only ever hatch 1 egg and raise 1 chick. And what's interesting is that they are winter breeders in South Africa. So the bulk of the breeding for wattled cranes occurs during the months of June and July, which makes researching and monitoring them very interesting. So basically, the country had an overall estimated decline of wattled cranes of about 38% between 1970 and 2000. I mean, it was already a small population in the country, but quite a significant decline, which basically left 90% of the country's population located here in the heart of the KZN Midlands and the southern Drakensberg of KwaZulu-Natal, with the remaining 10% of the population found in Mpumalanga and the northeastern Cape, so around the Ugie-Maclear area. So this is an example of a typical wetland that wattled cranes will use for breeding, foraging, and raising chicks. They tend to select natural open water within wetlands. We do have a small percentage of pairs that utilize open water created by dams, but the vast majority of pairs select for this kind of open water that you see within the wetland. And that's a view of a nest site in Umgeni Flay. Those of you guys who have been to Umgeni Flay, you would see these big patches of open natural water within the wetland. And you can see the birds build these large platforms. So there's one here, and then there's a bird sitting on a platform there. So basically the approach to conserve, about 25 years ago, a need was identified to conserve South Africa's crane species, and in particular South Africa's wattled crane population, with a two-pronged approach. So basically looking at the in situ wild population of wattled cranes, and then looking at an ex situ breeding and release program for wattled cranes in the country. And there's partners and stakeholders involved with both of those arms of the approach. And in terms of the in situ side of things, the main role players and stakeholders is Ezemvelo KZN Wildlife, the Endangered Wildlife Trust, it's the organisation I work for, and the KZN Crane Foundation. And then obviously the landowners. We couldn't do this work without the farmers. And then with regards to the ex situ side of things, that falls under the umbrella of the Wattled Crane Recovery Program, and I'll touch on that. And it's a formal partnership with 5 organisations. So in terms of in situ work with wattled cranes, we obviously need to understand both the species and the species requirements with regards to habitats. And we've been doing extensive aerial surveys of all 3 crane species, but it really emanated from the need of understanding the status of wattled cranes within KwaZulu-Natal. And Ezemvelo initiated aerial surveys, it's actually 21 years ago now. We flew the 21st consecutive year this year in July, which is a pretty impressive feat for a provincial agency. And we've also looked at extensive research looking at environmental determinants that promote successful wattle crane breeding, so both successful breeding as well as continued breeding. We've also been running a colour ringing program for cranes over the last 18 years, and that's fitting of colour rings on juveniles. And last year we also looked at initiating a trap camera research project at wattle crane nest sites. So that's an example of the kind of photographs we're getting from the nest sites of wattle cranes. It's been incredible. It's the first time we've placed trap cameras at wattle crane nest sites. We've had no issues whatsoever with the cameras at the nest site with the birds. And what's been interesting is that last year we didn't collect any eggs from nests, and we were able to document the egg abandonment extensively. So once the first chick had hatched, we were able to document how long it takes actually for the birds to abandon that second egg. So in terms of the colour ringing, we've ringed about 160 wattle crane chicks in nearly 20 years with a 65% resighting rate for those individuals, so pretty damn good. The chick on the left there is about to fledge. It's about a 14-week-old chick. It's about the biggest real target before we teach it to fly. And then with the ringing, we take a whole bunch of measurements as well. This is a chick that was caught on Impentley Nature Reserve, a KZN Wildlife Reserve. And then basically the chicks are fitted with a unique combination of colour rings, which becomes the bird's ID book. So when we resight this bird in future, we're able to know the individual, where it was born, how old it is, how far it's moved, when it starts breeding, and then if obviously we find dead birds, we can look at age-specific mortality as well. And then the chicks release back to the parents with no issues. And if you can see the parent in the middle there is fitted with colour rings. That's a 15-year-old female bird. And then obviously without the habitat we don't have cranes. So a lot of our effort is focused on habitat conservation, both protection as well as understanding the habitat to improve the management thereof or the functioning of the habitat. So we are undertaking a process of assessing the ecological states of wetlands used by wattle cranes for breeding, both currently and historically. And then from those, looking at developing management guidelines for farmers as well as management authorities and wetland rehabilitation agencies to look at implementing rehabilitation projects. We also have two extensive stewardship projects that focus on wattle cranes, one in southern Drakensberg, where we're looking at proclamation. It's actually higher than that now. It's over 5,000 hectares in KZN and about the same in Eastern Cape, around crane areas. And then in the Hlatakulu catchment, we're looking at a catchment stewardship approach that will protect between 12 and 15 breeding pairs of wattle cranes. So that's the Hlatakulu area. And you can see there with a very small link, we could link through from the Hlatakulu catchment through Zulu Waters Game Reserve, which is a recently proclaimed nature reserve, through to Moore Park and Wagon Drift, along the continuum of the highland grassland areas down into the thornveld of around Wagon Drift Dam. And then KZN Wildlife has a target of 100 breeding pairs in the province. We're sitting at about 78 breeding pairs of wattle cranes. And so we can't just focus on protecting what's currently being used by wattle cranes, but also looking at rehabbing and protecting future sites for wattle cranes to try and promote a growing population of breeding wattle cranes. So we provide extensive input into priority wetlands for rehab, to working for wetlands, as well as a Section 21 company called Eastern Wetland Rehab. And we are directly supporting 3 wetlands important for wattle crane breeding in terms of their rehabilitation. And then directly related to the species, one of the biggest threats other than habitat loss is the collision with overhead power lines. And thanks to Eskom in 2000, they completed marking of power lines within 500 meters of nesting wattle cranes. We are going to review this process in 2015 because we've had a significant increase in the number of new breeding pairs of wattle cranes, so we wanted to look at new sites. And as a result of all of that effort, that is the trend for wattle crane numbers in KZN over the last 13 years. A really nice positive outlook. You know, the population is definitely stable with a slight increase over the last few years. And this year actually saw us recording over 300 wattle cranes for the first time in the history of the aerial surveys and monitoring wattle cranes in the province. So a huge kudos to everyone involved over the last sort of 25 years of conservation. So onto the ex situ side of things. The Wattle Crane Recovery Program was born out of a PHVA that was done in 1999 looking at wattle crane conservation efforts and a review of that process. And from that, it was decided to supplement the wild population from collected second eggs. So like I mentioned, the birds abandon the second egg, and then we can go in and collect that second egg once the first egg is hatched. And then each organization involved there has a specific role or responsibility within the program. So Ezemvelo is the legal mandated province that has all ownership rights of every wattle crane that is collected from second eggs from the wild. The EWT that I work for, we're responsible for all the in-situ work, so all the conservation work I've just touched on. And then Joburg Zoo and PASA, as it's now known, is responsible for the management of the captive flock. And then the KZN Crane Foundation, based in Nottingham Road, is responsible for the rearing and the eventual release of wattle cranes into the wild. So I'll focus in on that now. So basically, we collect the second eggs once the first egg is hatched through a really cool technique that allows us to determine hatch date for the eggs. The chick is then hatched in an incubator, so it receives its last sort of 3 days of incubation in an incubator. And then it enters the wattle crane recovery program. So till this point, the collections have been building a captive population of wattle cranes, which is sitting at 47 birds, held mostly with Joburg Zoo, but also at a facility in the Hlatikulu. And most of those birds have come from second egg collections. So almost all of them are owned by Ezemvelo KZN Wildlife. However, from this year, we've actually now shifted the focus from building the captive flock to rearing for release. And that's under the lead and guidance of the KZN Crane Foundation. And that's what Laura would have been presenting on today. So this year, the Crane Foundation launched the Wattle Crane Rearing Nursery at the Bill Barnes Crane and Orrery Nature Reserve. They had over 200 people attend the launch of one of the greenest buildings in the country. That's a view of the nursery where the chicks will be raised. And then the domes are exercise domes and roosting domes. So you see the dome with the water is the dome that will teach the birds to roost in water at night. So when they're released into the wild, they know that they have to get their feet wet and not go and perch up on a hill where they'll be eaten by a jackal or caracal or people. So this year saw us actually collect the first 3 eggs for the chicks at the nursery, and all 3 eggs hatched and all 3 chicks have survived and are doing very well. And they're currently being reared using an isolation puppet rearing technique that's been developed by the International Crane Foundation and proves very, very successful in terms of being able to integrate the captive reared birds into the wild population. And in line with that, Laura's actually going to be conducting her PhD over the next 3 years, looking at bridging the gap between captive isolation rearing and the survival of those individuals in the wild after release. And so from next year, we'll be looking at rearing chicks from release, for release, based on the lessons learned this year on these 3 chicks. So that's just a couple of photos showing sort of the process. So the person has to be in a full suit so that the chick knows to grow up thinking it's a wattle crane and not a human being. And it's been quite incredible. The chicks are really, really smart. Before, we had a pocket that you could actually have your eyes open. And the chicks constantly focused on our faces with the eyes and not on the puppet, which is actually the head of the wattle crane. So they were registering the eyes as the being. And so now we actually all have to walk around when we walk the chicks with very dark sunglasses. And so that the bird then focuses on the puppet. And another thing, like little things you learn, when you feed the chick, the food would come out of the pocket with the other hand. So they actually stopped looking at the puppet hand and looked at your human hand, which was getting the food. So it's little things about that you take for granted that the birds will be learning from you in everything you do. So it's really about trying to mimic what would, to the best of our ability, what would happen in the wild. Teaching the birds to hide when there's predators. So there's people that will walk in the reserve with dogs, and then the crane mom, or chick mom, will teach the chick to hide at that time, so to perceive danger and threats and those kind of things. So this is a chick, also slightly older, loving to bath. So from a very young age, the chicks are forced into water. So in the wild, from 12 years old, the chicks can swim and are interacting with water around the nest site on a daily basis. So that all looks, it's really great stuff. The benefits of supplementation goes beyond just adding individuals to a wild population. It's a project that really creates huge awareness around a species, great interest and commitment from the general public. It's an opportunity to get people really hands-on with birds that would ultimately be at quite a far distance away from you. But probably more importantly, it opens up doors for massive research opportunities through the essential post-release monitoring and research process that we have to follow under the IUCN reintroduction guidelines. So we've been testing tracking units, and all birds will be fitted with trackers. Not only the captive reared birds, but we are going to be fitting 12 trackers onto wild birds through the process of the next 6 months with the Ezemvelo's help. So basically, in conclusion, we saw a significant and regular decline of wattle cranes, actually of all 3 crane species in South Africa for 3 decades. However, we can clearly see that decline has halted, and the number of breeding pairs is actually gradually increasing. The number of breeding pairs bottomed out at about 53 pairs. We're now sitting at 78 breeding pairs. And that's proved largely to a successful, well-coordinated and multi-pronged, multi-stakeholder approach to conserving the species. And specifically with regards to the wattle crane recovery program, this has proved really effective or successful at the moment due to an effective partnership of 5 organizations that have clear roles and responsibilities and mandates to fulfill within their partnership. And that it's only been possible through transparent and regular communication with partners. And sometimes has proved very difficult, considering we based across KZN and Johannesburg, or Gauteng, as well as in Mpumalanga. But we've made it work for the last 12 years, which the partnership has existed for. So yeah, I'd just like to thank sponsors and all the rest of it. Thanks very much.